So, I'm going to talk about player motivation. But first, I'm just going to repeat one thing Bjarke said that I think is important. We're new with these faders, so I'll just reiterate, like, why do we have these faders? Design is making choices, and the mixing desk visualizes those choices for us. And very often, if you add something, you lose something else. But another thing is that if you don't make the choice, the players will make it for you. And that's important when it comes to the player motivation fader. So, player motivation. What is motivation? What is it when we talk about LARP? The first thing I think about when you say player motivation is the question, why do I LARP? And that's the wrong question here. This is not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about something else. I'm going to talk about what motivates players to take actions within my LARP. And this is here you see why you want to design this motivation, because when you make a LARP, you very often want the players to do a set of things, and if you don't have a clear idea about how you're going to make them do those things, you might end up with a completely different LARP from the one you were planning. The player motivation fader has two ends, like all the other faders. One of them is gamification, and the other is exploration. The top level is gamification. Gamification is when you introduce elements to your LARP that makes it like a game. For example, it can be goals and objectives. You have to find a certain magical thing within the LARP. Or it can be direct competition. That could be a giant fantasy battle where two teams are competing against each other. Or it could be a LARP where you're competing against the clock. For example, Family Anderson. It's a LARP where you both compete against the other players. You want to inherit as much as possible. But if you can't agree, no one inherits anything at the end of the LARP. So it's a double competition. And I think, like, this question, I won the LARP, is that possible to apply in any meaningful way after the LARP has ended? If you can, then there certainly has been some elements of gamification within the LARP when it was played. I also want to introduce this concept. It's not from game design theory, but from game theory within social sciences. A zero-sum game is a game where the resources within the game are finite. And that means that if I gain something, it means that you lose something. Very often when we make gamification elements within LARPs, this is what we will do. Like, for someone to be the king, someone has to be the peasant. And if a peasant wants to rise to be king, then that means the king has to stop being the king, usually. So, again, the Family Anderson. Here you have a very limited set of resources. You have all the things that you're meant to divide, and you can't introduce new things into the LARP, or at least it's not designed for you to do that. The set of resources is finite. Gamification is good because it makes the available actions very clear. If you have a clear goal or a clear as a motivation for your character, then it becomes obvious whether the action you take increases your chances of winning or decreases your chances of winning. If it becomes very clear if you get more or less of the thing you want through the actions you take. So it makes the game design very understandable often. And it can also be beginner friendly. This is important to remember if you're ever going to make educational LARPs for school children who have never LARPed before. A competition is easy to understand. I want more of that and I want more of it than the other ones. It's a competition. I understand what I'm supposed to do. On the other hand, not everyone enjoys competition. Some people will sort of shy away when there's a competition because it caters to competitive players. And also, not everything in life is a competition. For example, the family Anderson is about dividing up the inheritance. If the family Anderson was, instead of these characters in the family Anderson, if they didn't meet when they were going to divide the inheritance, but they met in the funeral, it stops to make sense to treat it as a game and a competition, because nobody wants to compete in a funeral about who can be the saddest person. Or you could probably design that LARP, but that's a completely different game, and the gamification motivation settings don't really cater to those experiences. The other end of the fader, bottom in like the visual representation, is exploration. And when you design for exploration, it's when you design a game where the players, or a LARP where the players are meant to explore something. And then I don't mean explore like find the treasure. That's more of a gamification element, but it's when you want to explore a situation. What does this family Anderson funeral look like? What does it feel like? You want to like delve into those feelings. LARP can be very powerful because it lets us experience these things we couldn't experience in real life. So we can use the LARP to simulate it. You can also use a LARP to explore systems and try to understand why people take actions that they do, like why do we oppress each other? Sometimes we want to explore those mechanisms, and we can use LARP for that, but it's not always the best to use gamification for it. When you design for exploration, you can often say that the story in itself is the goal of the game. LARP. I also think that for there to be exploration, there also needs to be an unknown. There needs to be something you don't know when you enter the LARP. And the unknown can be frightening. And because the unknown can be frightening, you want to build trust. And this is why gamification elements sometimes can sort of limit your ability to explore themes. And that's because when you are in a competition with others, you put up your guard because you don't want to lose. And that can sometimes make these feelings or these situations unavailable to you. So if you put the fader all the way down towards the exploration, you get the ones you can create these strong stories. And you can open up this room for sincerity where players can dare to be vulnerable within your LARP. But you also have this negative thing, or it can be negative, that it takes away risk. I think of it as sort of this Scandinavian social democracy curse, which is that sometimes we negotiate things so much that the interesting part disappears. Like, if we sat down to play the family Anderson and we made the LARP about trying to divide everything in a way as good as possible, then probably we could find like an optimal solution to how these children should divide the inheritance. But that's not necessarily more interesting, because you have taken away something when you have removed the competition. And sometimes players screw with your design. Afterwards, you're going to go and play a game called New Voices in Art. And New Voices in Art is a LARP that's, at least the way I interpret it, it's about like feeling insecure. And the first time I played Family Anderson, I decided I'm going to gamify this. They didn't put gamification here, but I'm going to gamify it. Oh, sorry, I meant New Voices in Art. I'm going to gamify New Voices in Art. It's about insecurity, but I am going to try to sell my art for as much money as possible. Which isn't what the LARP is about. It became that for me, and I had a lot of fun running around wheeling and dealing and selling my art for more money than anyone else, but I think I lost the experience that the designers were aiming for, so I'm happy I've played the LARP again afterwards, because sometimes you lose it if you change it. But as a designer, you can't always control what the players choose to motivate themselves with, as the LARP has started. And another thing I want to say is just about sophistication. Sometimes people will say that a game is unsophisticated, but the story is sophisticated, and I don't think that's true. Like, if you've ever tried to create a balanced set of combat rules for a fantasy LARP where there are both wizards and warriors, that's super difficult to tune to perfection. It's really sophisticated. While as if I want to make a LARP that is about a tragic family dinner, it doesn't require much design at all, because everybody knows what it's like to have a fight around the dinner table. So it's not about games being bad and stories being good or anything like that. It's just different ways to motivate your players to take the actions you want them to take within your LARP. Thank you.